Funding for this presentation has been made possible by the generosity of our supporters. Additional assistance has been provided by several institutions committed to the public exchange of ideas. Today's session is about justice, and, as is often the case, we shall begin with a story. Imagine for a moment that you are the driver of an old trolley car. It is moving down the track at around 60 miles per hour. The air is rushing past, the wheels rattle on the rails. Suddenly, you notice that far ahead, 5 workers are busy repairing the line. They have their backs to you and are quite unaware of the danger. You reach for the brake, but it does not respond. You try again. Nothing. The brakes have failed. A heavy realization comes over you. If the trolley continues straight ahead, all 5 of those workers will be killed. There is no uncertainty about it. In that moment of helplessness, you glance to your right. There, you see a side track branching away from the main line. At the far end of this side track is a single worker. The steering mechanism works. You could, if you choose, turn the trolley onto that side path, ending the life of one person but sparing the 5 ahead of you. This leads to our first question. What is the right thing to do? Would you steer onto the side track, sacrificing one life to save 5? Or would you remain on your current path? If we take a show of hands, we usually find that the majority would turn the trolley. The reasoning is straightforward. It cannot be right to allow 5 people to die when you can prevent it by taking the life of only one. Some might recall real events, such as the passengers on a hijacked plane on September the 11th, 2001, who forced their aircraft down into a field in Pennsylvania, killing everyone aboard, but preventing the deaths of many more in crowded buildings. A tragic choice, but one made to limit the loss of life. Still, not all agree. A smaller group would refuse to turn the trolley. They argue that deliberately choosing to take an innocent life, even to save others, sets a precedent that can justify terrible acts such as genocide or oppressive rule, all in the name of some greater good. So, what would you do in such a case? Now, let us change the situation slightly. This time, you are not driving. You are standing on a bridge, looking down at the trolley line below. You see the same scenario. 5 workers at the end of the track, a runaway trolley heading directly toward them. You cannot stop the trolley. You have no brake lever, no steering wheel. But beside you stands a very large man leaning over the railing. And then a thought occurs. If you were to push him over the edge, his body would block the trolley. He would die, but the 5 workers would live. How many of you would push him? In nearly every audience, only a small number of hands go up. The majority will not. So here is the obvious question. What became of the principle that so many accepted in the first case, that it is better to sacrifice one life in order to save 5? Those who see a difference often say this. In the first case, the one worker on the side track was already part of the unfolding tragedy. The large man on the bridge was not. To push him feels like direct, intentional killing, and somehow that feels different. Others argue there is no real difference. In both cases, you make a conscious decision that determines who dies. Yet for many, the act of pushing another human being with one's own hands is morally harder to accept than steering a machine away from its original path. Let us consider yet another variation. This time, you are a doctor in an emergency department. 6 patients arrive from a trolley accident. 5 have moderate injuries, 1 is severely hurt. If you spend the day treating the severely injured patient, the 5 with moderate injuries will die. If you treat the 5 first, the severely injured patient will die. Most people say they would save the 5. The reasoning, again, is that it is better to save the greater number. Now, one final example. You are still a doctor, but now a transplant surgeon. 5 of your patients each need a different organ: a heart, a lung, a liver, a kidney, and a pancreas. Without transplants, they will die very soon. There are no donors available. In the next room, however, is a healthy man who has come in for a routine checkup. He is resting comfortably, unaware of the crisis. You could take his organs, sacrificing him, but saving the 5. In nearly every audience, almost no one says they would do this. Even though the numbers are identical, 1 life against 5, something feels very different about the means. And so we see questions of justice cannot always be answered by counting lives alone. The method, the intention, and the directness of our actions all play a part in our moral reasoning.
That's quite a clever point, though I must say it somewhat disrupts the philosophical essence we were trying to grasp. So let's take a step back from these tales and debates for a moment and reflect on how these arguments have started to take shape. From our discussions, certain moral principles have begun to crystallize, and it's worth pausing to consider their nature. The first of these principles suggests that the morally right action is determined by the consequences that follow from it. In other words, it is better for 5 to live, even if that means 1 must perish. This approach is what philosophers call consequentialist moral reasoning, where morality is anchored in the outcomes or results of one's actions, the way the world changes because of what we do. But then, as we dug deeper into those scenarios, when folks hesitated to push the large man off the bridge or felt uneasy about taking organs from an innocent patient, the picture grew more complicated. Here, many appealed to reasons concerned with the very nature of the act itself, beyond just the consequences. Regardless of what followed, there was a strong sense that some actions are simply wrong, absolutely wrong, like killing an innocent person, even if it means saving 5 others. This reflects a different kind of moral thinking, categorical moral reasoning. Categorical moral reasoning holds that morality rests on absolute duties and rights that must be respected no matter the outcomes. It's about fixed moral laws, not flexible calculations. Over the coming weeks, we'll explore the tension between these two ways of thinking, consequentialist and categorical ethics. To illustrate, one of the most influential examples of consequentialist reasoning is utilitarianism, a theory pioneered by Jeremy Bentham, an 18th-century English philosopher. Meanwhile, the most prominent figure in categorical moral philosophy is Immanuel Kant, a German thinker from the same century. We will examine their ideas closely, along with other perspectives. If you glance at the syllabus, you'll notice we'll be reading the works of great thinkers like Aristotle, John Locke, Kant himself, John Stuart Mill, and others. But more than just reading these venerable texts, we will engage with modern political and legal controversies that raise similar philosophical questions. We'll debate issues like equality and inequality, affirmative action, the limits of free speech versus hate speech, same-sex marriage, military conscription, and other pressing matters. Not merely to bring life to abstract treatises, but to illuminate what is at stake in our daily and political lives, the very practical heart of philosophy. Now, this all might sound appealing, but I must offer a caution. Approaching these texts as exercises in self-knowledge carries inherent risks both personal and political, risks well known to every student of political philosophy. These risks arise because philosophy unsettles us by confronting what we already know. There is an irony here. The challenge of this course is that it teaches what you already know, but in a strange way. It takes what we assume as normal and unquestioned and renders it unfamiliar. This is how the hypotheticals we started with functioned, blending seriousness with playfulness. It's also the way philosophical works operate. Philosophy estranges us not by handing us new facts, but by inviting us to see the familiar through a new lens. Yet here lies the risk. Once the familiar turns strange, it is never quite the same again. Gaining self-knowledge is akin to losing innocence. No matter how unsettling, it can never be unlearned. What makes this endeavor so challenging, yet compelling, is that moral and political philosophy is essentially a story. And while you don't know where the story will lead, you know one thing: it is your story. Those are the personal risks. And politically? One might hope that by reading these books and engaging in debates, you'd emerge a more responsible citizen, able to critically examine public policy, sharpen your political judgment, and participate effectively in civic life. But that promise is partial and perhaps misleading. Political philosophy has often not worked that way. Sometimes it can make you a worse citizen before it makes you a better one. Philosophy, after all, is a distancing and sometimes debilitating pursuit. Consider Socrates. In Plato's dialogue Gorgias, a friend named Callicles warns Socrates to stop philosophizing. Callicles calls philosophy a mere toy, harmless only if pursued moderately and at the right time. Go too far, he says, and it leads to ruin. His advice? Abandon argument, learn practical skills, and emulate those with prosperous lives and good reputations instead of wasting time on petty disputes. Callicles essentially tells Socrates, stop daydreaming, get real, go into business. And he had a point. Philosophy distances us from conventions, settled beliefs, and established assumptions. These are the personal and political risks. And often, when faced with these risks, people fall back on skepticism. The skeptical evasion goes something like this. We haven't conclusively resolved these cases or principles, and if great thinkers like Aristotle, Locke, Kant, and Mill haven't solved them over centuries, who are we to expect to do so in a single semester here in Sanders Theater? Maybe it's just a matter of each person having their own principles, and there's no definitive reasoning to be had. This skepticism, however, is an evasion. One I'd respond to like this. Yes, these questions have been debated endlessly, but precisely because they persist, they are unavoidable. We confront them every day in the choices we make. Thus, simply giving up on moral reflection isn't an option. Kant captured this well, describing skepticism as a resting place for reason, a moment to reflect on its errors, but never a permanent home. Simply surrendering to skepticism can never quell the restless spirit of reason. Through these stories and debates, I hope to convey some sense of the risks and temptations, the perils and possibilities inherent in this pursuit. Ultimately, the goal of this course is to awaken the restless spirit of reason and see where it might lead.
Whether we are reflecting upon the choices to be made in our own lives or considering, in the capacity of legislators or engaged citizens, the nature of laws that ought to govern society, a certain principle often presents itself as a moral compass, that the right course of action, whether on an individual or collective level, is that which maximizes the sum total of happiness. This ethical stance, famously associated with Jeremy Bentham, is frequently encapsulated by the maxim, the greatest good for the greatest number. With this foundational principle of utility established, it is worth putting it to the test. To do so, we turn to a case, not a hypothetical scenario, but a real event, which has become a landmark in legal and moral discourse. The Queen v. Dudley and Stevens, a 19th-century British case, extensively examined in law schools and frequently debated in discussions of moral philosophy. The facts of the matter, as recorded in a contemporary newspaper, begin with the assertion that few tragedies at sea have ever been more harrowing than that of the survivors of the yacht Mignonette. The vessel foundered in the South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 1,300 miles from the Cape of Good Hope. There were 4 men aboard: Captain Thomas Dudley, first mate Edwin Stevens, an able seaman named Edmund Brooks, all described by the press as men of excellent character, and the cabin boy, Richard Parker, a youth of 17 years. Parker, an orphan without family, was on his first extended voyage at sea. The report notes that he undertook the journey against the counsel of his friends, motivated by the hopeful ambition of youth and a desire to prove himself. Tragically, it was not to be. The yacht was struck by a wave and sank. The 4 managed to escape in a small lifeboat, their only provisions consisting of 2 tins of preserved turnips and no fresh water. For the first 3 days, they consumed nothing. On the 4th day, they opened 1 tin of turnips, dividing it between them. Subsequently, they succeeded in capturing a turtle, and together with the remaining tin of turnips, this sustained them for several days. Thereafter, for a period of 8 days, they had neither food nor water. During this time, Parker drank seawater despite the warnings of the others, which left him gravely ill. He lay at the bottom of the boat, clearly weakened and seemingly near death. On the 19th day, Captain Dudley suggested that lots be drawn to determine who should sacrifice his life for the survival of the rest. Brooks declined to participate in such a lottery, though whether his refusal stemmed from moral conviction or from an unwillingness to risk himself is unknown. Ultimately, no lots were drawn. The following day brought no sign of rescue. Dudley instructed Brooks to turn his head away and signaled to Stevens that Parker should be killed. Dudley then offered a prayer, informed Parker that his time had come, and used a penknife to cut his jugular vein. Brooks, despite his earlier objections, took part in consuming Parker's flesh and blood. For 4 days, the 3 survivors subsisted on the remains of the cabin boy. On the 24th day, Dudley recorded in his diary with stark understatement, "On the 24th day, as we were having our breakfast, a ship appeared at last." The survivors were taken aboard a German vessel, which transported them to Falmouth, England. Upon arrival, they were placed under arrest. Brooks, in exchange for immunity, agreed to give evidence against Dudley and Stevens. At trial, Dudley and Stevens did not contest the facts. Their defense rested on the plea of necessity, that it was preferable for 1 to die so that 3 might survive. The prosecution, however, rejected such reasoning, asserting that the deliberate taking of a life constituted murder, irrespective of the circumstances. Now, imagine the role of the jury in this case. Stripping away the complexities of statute and precedent and considering only the moral question, was the act committed morally permissible or was it morally reprehensible? Those inclined to acquit argued that in situations of extreme necessity, survival may take precedence over conventional moral rules, and that the defendants facing certain death acted in a manner consistent with preserving the greatest number of lives. Others held firmly that no degree of necessity can justify the taking of an innocent life, and that the boundary between survival instinct and moral law must not be transgressed. The case thus stands as a compelling examination of utilitarian ethics, forcing us to confront the enduring question: should moral principles be absolute, or may they yield under the weight of extreme necessity?